Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Agents of Subversion, The Fate of John T. Downey and the CIA's Covert War in China by John Delury. Narrated by Goettl. Prologue. Hong Kong was already a spy's paradise when war between American and Chinese forces in Korea gave added impetus to covert activity in the British colony. Under the anxious eye of the colonial police, CIA officers, communist underground, and nationalist sympathizers scrambled for intel on the enemy and recruits for their cause. It didn't take long before someone spotted Li Jianying, a 44-year-old junior officer in the National Army who chose not to follow his commander-in-chief, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, into exile in Taiwan. Instead, Li slipped over the porous border into the Crown Colony of Hong Kong sometime in 1949, joining 500,000 refugees eking out a meager existence in the shadow of the communist-controlled mainland. Li was the ideal recruit for a clandestine project, sponsored by the CIA, to recruit agents of subversion from the so-called Third Force, patriotic Chinese like him who rejected Mao Zedong's Communist Party yet despised Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists almost as much. The CIA arranged for Li's surreptitious transport to a secret base on the western Pacific island of Saipan for paramilitary training, and then moved him onward to another CIA facility near the U.S. Navy airfield outside Tokyo. In September 1952, with fighting in Korea locked in a bloody stalemate, an unmarked American plane dropped Li into the forbidding wilderness of China's Changbai Mountain region, straddling the border with North Korea. His assignment was to link up with a pair of five-man teams who had parachuted in the months prior. Collectively, their mission was to foment counterrevolution against Mao's young nation, the People's Republic of China, in the name of the Third Force. A couple months later, during Thanksgiving week, Connecticut-born John Thomas Downey, only a year out of Yale College, was far from home. He was enjoying a convivial dinner in Tokyo with his fellow CIA officers in the Far East outfit, and spirits were high. Downey's unit had been running Li Jianying and the other Third Force agent teams in Manchuria, maintaining radio communications and keeping them resupplied by airdrop. Some very good news had come from Li that the Alpha team, dropped in July, established contact with the disaffected ex-National Army general. Li requested exfiltration as soon as possible so that he could report to headquarters in person. Downey's dinner companions in Japan felt pangs of envy for Jack and his partner Dick, 27-year-old Boston University graduate Richard George Fecteau, who were headed from Tokyo to Seoul, where they would continue into Communist China to pick up Agent Li. The unmarked C-47 made an uneventful flight from South Korea to Sandow Gully, the rendezvous point in a remote location on the China side of the Yalu River. The pilot and co-pilot were employees of CAT, Civil Air Transport, a Taiwan-based commercial airline secretly owned by the CIA and chartered when needed for covert missions across Asia. Jack Downey had been on one of these flights before, in August, when he rode along for a resupply drop. But this time around, he had a most unusual assignment. As the plane came in low and slow, Downey and Fecteau were supposed to lower a hook that would latch onto a wire strung between goalposts on the ground. The wire was fastened to a backpack to be worn by the intrepid Li Jianying, who would be lofted in the air without the plane having to land. Once snatched off the ground, Li was to be reeled in like a fish by Downey and Fecteau. The CAT pilots would speed back to safety and debriefing in Japan. As the plane approached Sandow Gully, the men could make out Li's ground signal for the go-ahead, a triangle of small fires. But it was not Li Jianying lying on the snow-packed ground. He was in the custody of Chinese public security officers, and there would be no pickup without landing. As the C-47 coasted in on the third pass to drop the hook, guns opened fire from both sides of the ravine. The plane careened down to the hard earth, crashing into a bank of trees. The two CAT pilots were dead on impact, but Downey and Fecteau survived the crash. A grainy photograph captures the moment when two CIA spies were caught red-handed, hands behind their backs, in the winter wilderness of Red China, day one of the longest known imprisonment of American intelligence officers by a foreign government. It would take over 2 decades before Downey was able to walk back to freedom across Lo Wu Bridge into Hong Kong, where the Third Force Project had begun. Hero with 1,000 Faces. The seed of this book was planted one day in November 2014, as I learned about the events of November 1952 and Jack Downey's obituary in the New York Times. I was teaching Chinese history and international affairs at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea, having returned to academia from a stint working on U.S.-China relations at a non-government organization in New York, the Asia Society. Before that, I had spent a dozen years studying at Yale, with extended periods of language training and historical research in Beijing, Nanjing, and Taipei. Given my background, I wondered how I could never have heard of Jack Downey, Yale class of 1951, sent by the CIA to fight in the Korean War, imprisoned in Beijing for over 20 years. How could our paths not have crossed when I was at Yale for undergrad, or when I returned to New Haven for graduate school, with Downey living nearby as a retired judge? Why wasn't his story, which intersected with so many pivotal events in U.S.-China relations in the early Cold War, better known, and could it serve as the basis for a book? My friend Evan Osnos told me he was intrigued by the same obituary, but whereas he regretted it was too late to talk to Downey and profile him for the New Yorker, I had just the opposite reaction. As I tell my students, the simplest definition of history is the study of the dead. Soon, I was immersing myself in the worlds that created the failed covert mission of Jack Downey and the counter-espionage coup of the fake Li Junyin. I read widely and scoured for sources on U.S.-China relations in the early Cold War, the overheated debates over China policy, and profound reflections on America's place in the post-war order, the murky history of intelligence and rocky rise of the CIA, the role of counterrevolutionary subversion in U.S. foreign policy and perceived threat of subversion at home. I delved into the civil, international wars in China, Korea, and Vietnam that reshaped East Asia, and tracked covert activities along an archipelago of subversion radiating out from the islands of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Saipan, and Okinawa, with targets reaching all the way to the Manchurian mountaintops and Tibetan plateau. I pulled the thread of the Third Force, studying writings by its philosophers like Karsun Chang, generals like Zhang Faqui, and admirers like George Marshall. The research allowed me to re-examine aspects in the construction of the early Maoist state, from the deft diplomacy of Zhou Enlai to the thick security apparatus overseen by Lo Ri-ching. The histories of early Cold War America and high socialist China presented unexpected and unnerving parallels, despite their obvious and profound differences. As happens when inspiration meets with reality, the nature of my project shifted along the path of research. My attempt to reach out to the Downey family went unanswered. I learned of book projects in the works that would tell the story of his life, and, above all, the more research, reading, and drafting I did, the less my manuscript had to do with the person Jack Downey. Historians stress the importance of agency, a choice made by the historian about who or what functions as the primary actor in a narrative or analysis. As I dove deeper in this project, Downey was turning out not to have much agency in the story I was telling. Instead, he functioned like a cipher whose decryption unlocked insights into the individuals, organizations, and forces operating around him. His professors at Yale and their peers in the world of ideas, his employers at the CIA, and their colleagues in the circles of government and intelligence, his agents in Hong Kong and across the archipelago of subversion, his enemies on the ground in Manchuria and party headquarters in Beijing. And so, Downey's journey from Connecticut to China and back provides a narrative arc, akin to the archetypal hero in the monomyth identified by Joseph Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, 1949, to which this book's section titles owe their names. But while Downey's experience provides an almost mythic journey structure, he is not in fact the hero or central subject of this book. He is more like the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. He calls us to adventure, then vanishes from sight for long stretches of time, and finding him is the key to getting back home. The hero, in the historiographical sense of agency, of this book, is not any single person, but rather the relationship between two countries and peoples, the United States and China, during an extended period of profound hostility, suspicion, and ignorance captured by the term Cold War. The principal theme is how unreasonable hopes and irrational fears of subversion aggravated destructive tendencies toward political repression in both nations, albeit to differing degrees. The forces of subversion and repression link U.S. and Chinese political, intelligence, and diplomatic history during the 1950s and 1960s in complex and disturbing ways, and are documented here in depth. There were voices speaking out against subversion, repression, and secrecy, and these counterforces, too, have agency in this book. In particular, an extraordinary quartet of thinkers active in the early Cold War, in the years Jack Downey was studying at Yale and working for the CIA, whom I call simply the realists. Midwestern WASPs George Kennan and Reinhold Niebuhr, and German Jewish refugees Hans Morgenthau and Hannah Arendt wrote seminal works in the late 1940s and early 1950s that, in different ways, warned of the perilous linkage between subversion abroad and repression at home. Decrying McCarthyism, the realists worried more about the threat of repression, even totalitarianism, emerging from within the United States than the risk of communism conquering the world in the name of Moscow or Beijing. Applying the philosophical insights of the realists to the narrower field of Far Eastern policy were another counterforce, referred to as the China hands, epitomized by John King Fairbank of Harvard University. Liberal China hands in government and out bore the brunt of McCarthyism, starting with Joe McCarthy's attack on Owen Lattimore of Johns Hopkins University. Reactionary defenders of the nationalist regime on Taiwan, supported by scholars like David Nelson Rowe at Yale, won the policy argument in the Eisenhower era. Lattimore ended up in England, and Fairbank retreated into scholarship. The realists, too, faded somewhat from public prominence, overshadowed by the powerful consensus around hawkish liberal internationalism. It took the nightmare of the war in Vietnam to bring Kennan, Morgenthau, and Fairbank back to the public stage, as the realists renewed their arguments against hubris and China hands called for détente with Beijing. The realists' call for self-reflection and restraint may have seemed off-key during that golden decade of American power, virtue, and covert action, running from the Korean armistice to the Kennedy assassination. But the tragic prescience of realist prudence is painfully evident by the end of our story, the dark age of Watergate. I researched and wrote the manuscript while living in South Korea, making regular trips to China, frequent visits to my native United States, and an extended stay in Vietnam. Even if much of the story ended up being about America's approach to China and the U.S. role in Asia, I have done my best to tell it with a rich and nuanced sense of the Chinese-Asian context and significance. Historians are forever looking for ways to escape our modern discipline's original sin as a handmaiden to the birth of the nation-state. I do not claim to have escaped the prison. But in exposing the covert underbelly of U.S.-China relations and probing the tensions between grand strategy, government policy, and individual experience, I hope that my telling of the tale at least rattles the bars of the self-satisfied patriotic narratives common in historical discourse on both sides of the Pacific. If Chinese and Americans are going to work out their future, they had better take a hard look at their past. My book is offered in that spirit of gazing unflinchingly into the mirror of history. Map of the Journey Ahead. The first section of the book, Axis Mundi, tells the backstory of U.S.-China relations coming out of World War II and through the Chinese Civil War, combining diplomatic, intelligence, and intellectual history to reconstruct the early Cold War conditions of possibility for the covert initiative that would ultimately put Jack Downey on a plane into Manchuria. The story begins with a jarring experience that Americans came to describe as the loss of China, Chapter 1. From the high point of signing an alliance days after Pearl Harbor, the relationship sank to a nadir of mutual disillusionment as Chiang Kai-shek's large but demoralized national army was challenged by Mao Zedong's disciplined People's Liberation Army, PLA. Many American observers were rooting for the unarmed underdog, a moderate option known as the Third Force. After the failure of a year-long mediation by an American envoy, George Marshall, Mao took the mainland, Chiang fled to Taiwan, and the Third Force regrouped in Hong Kong. The blame game in Washington over who had lost China was only getting started. With the Chinese Civil War and loss of China as background, Realism and Restraint, Chapter 2, widens the lens to look at the dilemmas posed by America's post-war determination to defend the free world. The writings of a strategist, Kennan, theologian, Niebuhr, academic, Morgenthau, and philosopher, Arendt, articulate a philosophical dissent from the emerging Cold War consensus. From the writings of the realists, we turn to the China hands, reconstructing the argument between three of the country's leading experts, Owen Lattimore, John King Fairbank, and David Nelson Rowe. Subversion and Repression, Chapter 3, explores how their policy debates became wrapped up in toxic political struggles with the rise of anti-communist politicians like Representative Richard Nixon and Senator Joe McCarthy, and the toll that McCarthyite repression took on the China field in particular. In Intelligence or Psy-War, Chapter 4, we shift frames again to look at the emergence of covert foreign policy and the birth of the CIA. The World War II experiment in civilian intelligence and guerrilla warfare, glamorized by the Jedburgh teams operating behind Nazi lines, was dismantled by President Truman, anxious about the risk of an American Gestapo. But Truman changed his mind amid Cold War fears of communist subversion and hopes in political warfare and Psy-War, duties that fell to the CIA. From its founding in 1947, the agency carried out separate functions embodied in two men profiled in this chapter: the analytical project of strategic intelligence pioneered by Sherman Kent, and the spying and subversive activities beloved by Allen Dulles. Readers will notice throughout the Axis Mundi chapters that Yale University functions as a window onto U.S.-China relations in early Cold War America. An exclusive, elite institution of about 10,000 faculty, students, and administrators, Yale was an important center for China studies, with a program led by the political scientist David Nelson Rowe, an obscure figure now who was in his day an influential scholar in the pro-Chiang camp, taking on Harvard's Fairbank and Hopkins' Lattimore. In Chapter 2, Yale offers a twist on the story of realism, as the university housed an influential school of geostrategists at the Yale Institute of International Studies. The Yale realists argued for restraint based strictly on power politics and national security, dispensing with the ethical dimension found in Niebuhr's Christian realism or Morgenthau's principled realism. In Chapter 3, the Yale campus is presented as a local battleground in the surge of subversion and repression unleashed by McCarthyism, pitting the right-wing student activist William F. Buckley, Jr., who rocketed to fame with the publication of God and Man at Yale, 1950, against the liberal university president Whitney Griswold, and reconstructing Professor Rowe's efforts to assist the prosecution of Owen Lattimore. Finally, Chapter 4 considers the leading role that Yaleys played in the early days of the CIA, which had a field day recruiting on campus, especially during the Korean War years. The Yale of Jack Downey's college years, 1947 through 1951, in other words, provides an illuminating microcosm of the main themes of the section: the loss of China, the philosophy of realism, the fear of subversion and tendency toward repression, and the rise of intelligence. The second part of the book, Call to Adventure, moves the locus of the action across the Pacific Ocean, showing how the U.S. government, spurred by frustration over the Korean War and fear of communist influence, launched a covert campaign to subvert the People's Republic of China. Jack Downey recedes even further from view as we survey decisions, events, and forces operating well above his pay grade. Just as Axis Mundi provides the backstory of the Chinese Civil War, Call to Adventure starts with a conflict that casts a long shadow. The focus is on the failures in intelligence by the United States and China that led them to be at war in Korea, Chapter 5, and the American reliance on covert paramilitary methods as conventional fighting failed to yield victory. For Mao Zedong, the so-called war to resist America and defend Korea created ideal conditions to launch his first nationwide mass movement, the campaign to suppress counterrevolutionaries, sweeping up a handful of American residents in the PRC along with millions of politically suspect Chinese. The Korean War strengthened American resolve to resist Mao Zedong, but reservations about Chiang Kai-shek were not easily shed. In the space created by that contradiction, renewed attention fell on the Third Force, Chapter 6. Variations on the idea of a third force were in the air during the early years of the Cold War, found in the speeches of French socialist Léon Blum, the novels of the British espionage writer Graham Greene, and the books of the American historian Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. It was an idea with a long history in 20th-century Chinese politics as well, best exemplified by the trials and tribulations of Kar-Sun Chang, a philosopher-politician whom George Marshall probably had in mind when he pined for a splendid group of men from the Third Force to take power, rather than the communists or nationalists. Kar-Sun Chang made a big pitch for U.S. support in his book Third Force in China, published in New York just months before Downey and Fecteau set off on their secret mission. Making Counter-Revolution, Chapter 7, continues the story of the Third Force, focusing on the evolution of America's covert, military interest in anti-Mao, anti-Chiang elements. Early contacts were established by the U.S. Wartime Intelligence Service, OSS, and during the Chinese Civil War, bold plans for arming anyone opposing the Communists were floating around Washington. In the context of the Korean War, Truman's National Security Council secretly approved aiding anti-communist forces, and the senior intelligence official at Far East Command in Tokyo encouraged the CIA to operationalize the Third Force idea as an armed group. The Third Force mission targeting Manchuria was just one of the CIA's counter-revolutionary projects, which ranged from China's frontier with Burma in the remote southwest to the southeastern coastal provinces and easy reach of Chiang Kai-shek's island fortress of Taiwan. Ground zero for weaponizing the Third Force was the British colony of Hong Kong, where our story moves next. Hong Kong Fight League, Chapter 8, reconstructs CIA outreach to Third Force intellectuals, generals, and agents, drawing on the memoirs of a key intermediary, Zhang Fekui, who along with Kar-Sun Chang founded the Fight League for a free and democratic China. Zhang doubted the efficacy of the Jedburgh model as applied to Mao's China, but he worked with his nameless American contacts to weaponize the Third Force. CCP counterintelligence watched the covert involvement of the United States in Hong Kong and Taiwan warily. While back at CIA headquarters, Director Beadle Smith worried that covert ops were distracting the agency from its primary mission of providing policymakers with strategic intelligence. Having established a recruitment node in Hong Kong, the Third Force operation transported volunteer agents to America's archipelago of Subversion in the Western Pacific, with intensive training in Saipan. The initial infiltration of counter-revolutionary teams escaped detection, but discovery of the liaison Li Jianying triggered a Manchurian manhunt, Chapter 9, by the public security and counter-espionage authorities. PRC sources allow in-depth reconstruction of the capture of CIA-backed Third Force guerrillas, shedding light on the workings of the internal security apparatus in the early Mao years. As the agents of Subversion were being captured and killed in Manchuria, U.S. military leaders continued to be stymied by Chinese defenses in Korea, as the American public, unhappy with the war effort, elected the World War II hero, former General Dwight Eisenhower, as president. The third section, Road of Trials, opens with Exfiltration, Chapter 10, which narrates the action-adventure story of Downey and Fecteau's mission into Manchuria in November 1952. PRC sources reveal Mao Zedong's personal comment on their capture and need to enhance anti-subversion efforts. The vicissitudes in U.S.-China relations during the first 2 years that Downey and Fecteau were held incognito, assumed dead by the CIA, is the subject of Quiet Americans, Chapter 11, including the Eisenhower administration's recalibration after the Korean War of support for Chiang Kai-shek and defunding of the Third Force. When Beijing shocked the CIA by announcing Downey and Fecteau were alive and imprisoned, a drawn-out diplomatic struggle commenced, in which Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, denied all charges of espionage and subversion, while Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai used the case to denounce American imperialist aggression, the topic of Subversion on Trial, Chapter 12. Implausible Denial, Chapter 13, traces the diplomatic standoff through the mid-1950s, with the two countries mired in a hostility epitomized by the American captives, despite a high-profile intervention by the United Nations Secretary-General and initiation of direct U.S.-China talks in Geneva. Even as the furies of McCarthyism subsided, and the CIA shifted focus away from sponsoring subversion to technologies of surveillance, Mao Zedong unleashed brutal grassroots campaigns to eliminate counterrevolutionaries and oppose rightists. The final section, Rescue from Without, returns to the individual plane of history, looking at how private citizens resisted the U.S. government ban on traveling to China, from journalists like William Worthy, Jr., to the spy moms, including Mary Downey, who visited their imprisoned sons in 1958. Prisoners of the Past, Chapter 14, uses their journeys to chart Sino-U.S. relations into the Kennedy years, an era of public apathy and policy inertia toward China, despite a second flare-up in the Taiwan Strait and uprisings across Tibet, assisted covertly by the CIA. By the early 1960s, the cultural significance of the Anglo-American secret agent was being reimagined and contested, from James Bond films and John le Carre novels to lesser-known academic works like Paul Blackstock's The Strategy of Subversion, even as Downey and Fecteau had become forgotten spies rotting in their cells. War and Revolution, Chapter 15, covers the tumultuous years when Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution turned China upside down, and LBJ's war in Vietnam tore America apart. A pivotal Senate hearing called by William Fulbright in 1966 ties together strands running from the beginning of the book, as the realists, in China hands, made a triumphant return to the public stage to challenge the conventional wisdom on Vietnam and China. Ironically, their theories were put into action through the complicated figure of Henry Kissinger, who negotiated an end to the era of hostility with China and the war in Vietnam, but who also, as consigliere to Richard Nixon, gutted realism of its moral compass, the subject of Release, Chapter 16. Kissinger included the two spies on the agenda for U.S.-China détente, and freedom for Dick Fecteau came in the lead-up to Nixon's visit to Beijing in February 1972. It took another year, and a mother's love, to liberate the last prisoner of the era of enmity, Jack Downey. The time traveled in our journey extends from the Chinese Civil War, 1945 through 49, until U.S.-China rapprochement, 1971 through 73, denoted as the Cold War between the United States and China. The standard meaning of Cold War refers, appropriately, to the geopolitical and ideological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. But in Asia, the Cold War took the form of a secondary competition between Washington and Beijing, who positioned themselves precariously amid the explosive nationalist leaders, movements, in peoples of post-colonial Asia. This Sino-American Cold War was hotter.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?